White Fang by Jack London. Chapter 4, Part 4, The Clinging Death. Beauty Smith slipped the chain from his neck and stepped back. For once, White Fang did not make an immediate attack. He stood still, ears pricked forward, alert and curious, surveying the strange animal that faced him. He'd never seen such a dog before. Tim Keenan shoved the bulldog forward with a muttered, "Go to it." The animal waddled towards the centre of the circle, short and squat and ungainly. He came to a stop and blinked across at White Fang. There were cries from the crowd of, "Go to him, Cherokee! Sick him, Cherokee! Eat him up!" But Cherokee didn't seem anxious to fight. He turned his head and blinked at the men, who shouted at the same time, wagging his stump of a tail good-naturedly. He was not afraid, but merely lazy. Besides, it didn't seem to him that it was intended he should fight with the dog he saw before him. He wasn't used to fighting with that kind of dog, and he was waiting for them to bring on the real dog. Tim Keenan stepped in and bent over Cherokee, fondling him on both sides of the shoulders, with hands that rubbed against the grain of the hair that made slight pushing forward movements. These were so many suggestions. Also, their effect was irritating, for Cherokee began to growl, very softly, deep down in his throat. There was a correspondence in rhythm between the growls and the movements of the man's hands. The growl rose in the throat with the culmination of each forward-pushing movement, and ebbed down to start up afresh with the beginning of the next movement. The end of each movement was the accent of the rhythm, the movement ending abruptly with the growling rising with a jerk. This wasn't without its effect on White Fang. The hair began to rise on his neck and across the shoulders. Tim Keenan gave a final shove forward and stepped back again. As the impetus that carried Cherokee forward died down, he continued to go forward of his own volition, in a swift, bow-legged run. Then White Fang struck. A cry of startled admiration went up. He had covered the distance and gone in more like a cat than a dog, and with the same cat-like swiftness, he had slashed with his fangs and leapt clear. The bulldog was bleeding back of one ear from a rip in his thick neck. He gave no sign, did not even snarl, but turned and followed after White Fang. The display on both sides, the quickness of the one and the steadiness of the other, had excited the partisan spirit of the crowd, and the men were making new bets and increasing original bets. Again and yet again, White Fang sprang in, slashed and got away untouched. And still his strange foe followed after him, without too great haste, not slowly, but deliberately and determinedly, in a businesslike sort of way. There was a purpose in his method, something for him to do that he was intent upon doing and from which nothing could distract him. His whole demeanour, every action was stamped with this purpose. It puzzled White Fang. Never had he seen such a dog. It had no hair protection. It was soft and bled easily. There was no thick mat of fur to baffle White Fang's teeth as they were often baffled by dogs of his own breed. Each time that his teeth struck, they sank easily into the yielding flesh, while the animal didn't seem to able to defend itself. Another disconcerting thing was that it made no outcry, such as he had been accustomed to with the other dogs he had fought. Beyond a growl or a grunt, the dog took its punishment silently, and never did it flag in his pursuit of him. Not that Cherokee was slow. He could turn and whirl swiftly enough, but White Fang was never there. Cherokee was puzzled too. He never fought before with a dog with which he could not close. The desire to close had always been mutual. But here was a dog that kept at a distance, dancing and dodging here and there and all about. When it did get its teeth into him, it did not hold on, but let go instantly and darted away again. But White Fang could not get at the soft underside of the throat. The bulldog stood too short, while its massive jaws were an added protection. White Fang darted in and out unscathed, while Cherokee's wounds increased. Both sides of his neck and head were ripped and slashed. He bled freely, but showed no signs of being disconcerted. He continued his plodding pursuit, though once, for the moment baffled, he came to a full stop and blinked at the men who looked on, at the same time wagging his stump of a tail as an expression of his willingness to fight. In that moment, White Fang was in upon him and out, in passing ripping his trimmed remnant of an ear. With a slight manifestation of anger, Cherokee took up the pursuit again, running on the inside of the circle that White Fang was making, and striving to fasten his deadly grip on White Fang's throat. The bulldog missed by a hair's breadth, and cries of praise went up as White Fang doubled suddenly out of danger in the opposite direction. The time went by. White Fang still danced on, dodging and doubling, leaping in and out, and never, ever inflicting damage. And still the bulldog, with grim certitude, toiled after him. Sooner or later he would accomplish his purpose, get the grip that would win the battle. In the meantime, he accepted all the punishment the other could deal him. His tufts of ears had become tassels. His neck and shoulders were slashed in a score of places, and his very lips were cut and bleeding, all from those lightning snaps that were beyond his foreseeing and guarding. Time and again, White Fang had attempted to knock Cherokee off his feet, but the difference in their height was too great. Cherokee was too squat, too close to the ground. White Fang tried the trick once too often. The chance came in one of his quick doublings and counter-circlings. He caught Cherokee with head turned away as he whirled more slowly. His shoulder was exposed. White Fang drove in upon it, but his own shoulder was high above, while he struck with such force that his momentum carried him on across the other's body. For the first time in his fighting history, men saw White Fang lose his footing. His body turned a half somersault in the air, and he would have landed on his back had he not twisted, cat-like, still in the air, in the effort to bring his feet to the earth. As it was, he struck heavily on his side. The next instant he was on his feet, but in that instant, Cherokee's teeth closed on his throat. It wasn't a good grip, being too low down towards the chest, but Cherokee held on. White Fang sprang to his feet and tore wildly around, trying to shake off the bulldog's body. It made him frantic, this clinging, dragging weight. It bound his movements, restricted his freedom. It was like the trap, and all his instinct resented it and revolted against it. It was a mad revolt. For several minutes, he was to all intents insane. The basic life that was in him took charge of him. The will to exist of his body surged over him. He was dominated by this mere flesh love of life. All intelligence was gone. It was as though he had no brain. His reason was unseated by the blind yearning of the flesh to exist and move. At all hazards to move, to continue to move, for movement was the expression of his existence. Round and round he went, whirling and turning and reversing, trying to shake off the 50-pound weight that dragged at his throat. The bulldog did little but keep his grip. Sometimes and rarely he managed to get his feet to the earth and for a moment to brace himself against White Fang. But the next moment his footing would be lost, and he would be dragging around in the whirl of one of White Fang's mad gyrations. Cherokee identified himself with his instinct. He knew that he was doing the right thing by holding on, and there came to him certain blissful thrills of satisfaction. At such moments, he even closed his eyes and allowed his body to be hurled hither and thither, willy-nilly, careless of any hurt that might thereby come to it. That didn't count. The grip was the thing, and the grip he kept. White Fang ceased only when he had tired himself out. He could do nothing, and he could not understand. Never in all his fighting had this thing happened. The dogs he had fought with did not fight that way. With them it was snap and slash and get away, snap and slash and get away. He lay partly on his side, panting for breath. Cherokee, still holding his grip, urged against him, trying to get him over entirely on his side. White Fang resisted, and he could feel the jaws shifting their grip, slightly relaxing and coming together again in a chewing movement. Each shift brought the grip closer into his throat. The bulldog's method was to hold what he had, and when opportunity favoured, to work in for more. Opportunity favoured when White Fang remained quiet. When White Fang struggled, Cherokee was content merely to hold on. The bulging back of Cherokee's neck was the only portion of his body that White Fang's teeth could reach. He got hold towards the base where the neck comes out from the shoulders. But he did not know the chewing methods of fighting, nor were his jaws adapted to it. He spasmodically ripped and tore with his fangs for a space. Then a change in their position diverted him. The bulldog had managed to roll him over on his back and was still hanging onto his throat, was on top of him, like a cat. White Fang bowed his hindquarters in, and with the feet digging into his enemy's abdomen above him, he began to claw with long, tearing strokes. Cherokee might well have been disemboweled had he not quickly pivoted on his grip and got his body off White Fang's and at right angles to it. There was no escaping that grip. It was like fate itself, and as inexorable. Slowly it shifted up along the jugular. All that saved White Fang from death was the loose skin of his neck and the thick fur that covered it. This served to form a large roll in Cherokee's mouth, the fur of which well nigh defied his teeth. But bit by bit, whenever the chance offered, he was getting more of the loose skin and fur in his mouth. The result was that he was slowly throttling White Fang. The latter's breath was drawn with greater and greater difficulty as the moments went by. It began to look as though the battle were over. The backers of Cherokee waxed jubilant and offered ridiculous odds. White Fang's backers were correspondingly depressed and refused bets of 10-1 and 20-1, though one man was rash enough to close a wager of 50-1. This man was Beauty Smith. He took a step into the ring and pointed his finger at White Fang. Then he began to laugh derisively and scornfully. This produced the desired effect. White Fang went wild with rage. He called up his reserves of strength and gained his feet. As he struggled around the ring, the 50 pounds of his foe ever dragging on his throat, his anger passed on into panic. The basic life of him dominated him again, and his intelligence fled before the will of his flesh to live. Round and back again, stumbling and falling and rising, even uprearing at times on his hind legs, and lifting his foe clear of the earth, he struggled vainly to shake off the clinging death. At last he fell, toppling backward, exhausted, and the bulldog promptly shifted his grip, getting in closer, mangling more and more of the fur-folded flesh, throttling White Fang more severely than ever. Shouts of applause went up for the victor, and there were many cries of "Cherokee! Cherokee!" To this, Cherokee responded by vigorous wagging of the stump of his tail. But the clamour of approval didn't distract him. There was no sympathetic relation between his tail and his massive jaws. The one might wag, but the other held their terrible grip on White Fang's throat. It was at this time that a diversion came to the spectators. There was a jingle of bells. Dog mushers' cries were heard. Everybody, save Beauty Smith, looked apprehensively, the fear of the police strong upon them. But they saw up the trail and not down 2 men running with sled and dogs. They were evidently coming down the creek from some prospecting trip. At sight of the crowd, they stopped their dogs and came over and joined it, curious to see the cause of the excitement. The dog musher wore a moustache, but the other, a taller and younger man, was smooth-shaven, his skin rosy from the pounding of his blood and the running in the frosty air. White Fang had practically ceased struggling. Now and again he resisted spasmodically and to no purpose. He could get little air, and that little grew less and less under the merciless grip that ever tightened. In spite of his armour of fur, the great vein of his throat would have long since been torn open had not the first grip of the bulldog been so low down as to be practically on the chest. It had taken Cherokee a long time to shift that grip upward, and this had also tended further to clog his jaws with fur and skin fold. In the meantime, the abysmal brute in Beauty Smith had been rising up into his brain and mastering the small bit of sanity that he possessed at best. When he saw White Fang's eyes beginning to glaze, he knew beyond doubt that the fight was lost. Then he broke loose. He sprang upon White Fang and began savagely to kick him. There were hisses from the crowd and cries of protest, but that was all. While this went on and Beauty Smith continued to kick White Fang, there was a commotion in the crowd. The tall young newcomer was forcing his way through, shouldering men right and left without ceremony or gentleness. When he broke through into the ring, Beauty Smith was just in the act of delivering another kick. All of his weight was on one foot and he was in a state of unstable equilibrium. At that moment, the newcomer's fist landed a smashing blow full in his face. Beauty Smith's remaining leg left the ground and his whole body seemed to lift into the air as he turned over backwards and struck the snow. The newcomer turned upon the crowd. "You cowards," he cried. "You beasts." He was in a rage himself, a sane rage. His grey eyes seemed metallic and steel-like as they flashed upon the crowd. Beauty Smith regained his feet and came towards him, sniffing and cowardly. The newcomer did not understand. He did not know how abject a coward the other was, and thought he was coming back intent on fighting. So with a "you beast," he smashed Beauty Smith over backwards with a second blow in the face. Beauty Smith decided the snow was the safest place for him, and he lay where he'd fallen, making no effort to get up. "Come on, Matt, lend a hand," the newcomer called to the dog musher who had followed him into the ring. Both men bent over the dogs. Matt took hold of White Fang, ready to pull when Cherokee's jaws should be loosened. This the younger man endeavoured to accomplish by clutching the bulldog's jaws in his hands and trying to spread them. It was a vain undertaking. As he pulled and tugged and wrenched, he kept exclaiming with every expulsion of breath, "Beasts!" The crowd began to grow unruly, and some of the men were protesting against the spoiling of the sport. But they were silenced when the newcomer lifted his head from his work for a moment and glared at them. "You damn beasts," he finally exploded and went back to his task. "It's no use, Mr. Scott. You can't break them apart that way," Matt said at last. The pair paused and surveyed the locked dogs. "Ain't bleeding much," Matt announced. "Ain't got all the way in yet, but he's liable to at any moment," Scott answered. "There, did you see that? He shifted his grip a bit." The younger man's excitement and apprehension for White Fang was growing. He struck Cherokee about the head savagely again and again, but that didn't loosen the jaws. Cherokee wagged the stump of his tail in advertisement that he understood the meaning of the blows, but that he knew he was himself in the right and only doing his duty by keeping his grip. "Won't some of you help?" Scott cried desperately at the crowd. But no help was offered. Instead, the crowd began sarcastically to cheer him on and showered him with facetious advice. "You'll have to get a pry," Matt counselled. The other reached into the holster at his hip, drew his revolver and tried to thrust its muzzle between the bulldog's jaws. He shoved and shoved hard till the grating of the steel against the locked teeth could be distinctly heard. Both men were on their knees, bending over the dogs. Tim Keenan strolled into the ring. He paused beside Scott and touched him on the shoulder, saying ominously, "Don't break them teeth, stranger." "Then I'll break his neck," Scott retorted, continuing his shoving and wedging with the revolver muzzle. "I said, don't break them teeth," the faro dealer repeated more ominously than before. But if it was bluff, he intended it didn't work. Scott never desisted from his efforts, so he looked up coolly and asked, "Your dog?" The faro dealer grunted. "Then get in here and break this grip." "Well, stranger," the other drawled irritatingly, "I don't mind telling you that's something I ain't worked out for myself. I don't know how to turn the trick." "Then get out of the way," was the reply. "Don't bother me, I'm busy." Tim Keenan continued standing over him, but Scott took no further notice of his presence. He had managed to get the muzzle in between the jaws on one side, was trying to get it out between the jaws on the other side. This accomplished, he pried gently and carefully, loosening the jaws a bit at a time, while Matt, a bit at a time, extricated White Fang's mangled neck. "Stand by to receive your dog," was Scott's peremptory order to Cherokee's owner. The faro dealer stooped down obediently and got a firm hold in Cherokee. "Now," Scott warned, giving the final pry. The dogs were drawn apart, the bulldog struggling vigorously. "Take him away," Scott commanded, and Tim Keenan dragged Cherokee back into the crowd. White Fang made several ineffectual efforts to get up. Once he gained his feet, but his legs were too weak to sustain him, and he slowly wilted and sank back into the snow. His eyes were half closed and the surface of them was glassy. His jaws were apart, and through them the tongue protruded, draggled and limp. To all appearances, he looked like a dog that had been strangled to death. Matt examined him. "Just about all in," he announced, "but he's breathing all right." Beauty Smith had regained his feet and come over to look at White Fang. "Matt, how much is a good sled dog worth?" Scott asked. The dog musher, still on his knees, and stooped over White Fang, calculated for a moment. $300, he answered. "And how much for one that's all chewed up like this one?" Scott asked, nudging White Fang with his foot. "Half of that," was the dog musher's agreement. Scott turned upon Beauty Smith. "Did you hear, Mr. Beast? I'm going to take your dog from you and I'm going to give you $150 for him." He opened his pocketbook and counted out the bills. Beauty Smith put his hands behind his back, refusing to touch the proffered money. "I ain't a-selling," he said. "Oh, yes, you are," the other assured him, "because I'm buying. Here's your money, the dog's mine." Beauty Smith, his hands still behind him, began to back away. Scott sprang towards him, drawing his fist back to strike. Beauty Smith cowered down in anticipation of the blow. "I've got my rights," he whimpered. "You forfeited your rights to own that dog," was the rejoinder. "Are you going to take the money, or do I have to hit you again?" "All right," Beauty Smith spoke up with the alacrity of fear, "but I take the money under protest," he added. "The dog's a mint. I ain't going to be robbed. A man's got his rights." "Correct," Scott answered, passing the money over to him. "A man's got his rights. You're not a man. You're a beast." "Wait till I get back to Dawson," Beauty Smith threatened. "I'll have the law on you. If you open your mouth when you get back to Dawson, I'll have you run out of town. Understand?" Beauty Smith replied with a grunt. "Understand?" the other thundered with abrupt fierceness. "Yes," Beauty Smith grunted, shrinking away. "Yes, what?" "Yes, sir," Beauty Smith snarled. "Look out, he'll bite," someone shouted, and a guffaw of laughter went up. Scott turned his back on him and returned to help the dog musher, who was working over White Fang. Some of the men were already departing. Others stood in groups, looking on and talking. Tim Keenan joined one of the groups. "Who's that mug?" he asked. "Weed and Scott," someone answered. "And who in hell is Weed and Scott?" the faro dealer demanded. "Oh, one of them crackerjack mining experts. He's in with all the big bugs. If you want to keep out of trouble, you'll steer clear of him. That's my talk. He's all hunky with the officials. The Gold Commissioner's a special pal of his." "I thought he must be somebody," was the faro dealer's comment. "That's why I kept my hands off him at the start." Part 5. The Indomitable. "It's hopeless," Weedon Scott confessed. He sat on the step of his cabin and stared at the dog musher, who responded with a shrug that was equally hopeless. Together they looked at White Fang at the end of his stretched chain, bristling, snarling, ferocious, straining to get at the sled dogs. Having received sundry lessons from Matt, said lessons being imparted by means of a club, the sled dogs had learned to leave White Fang alone, and even then they were lying down at a distance, apparently oblivious of his existence. "It's a wolf and there's no taming it," Weedon Scott announced. "Oh, I don't know about that," Matt objected. Might be a lot of dog in him, for all you can tell, but there's one thing I know, and that's no getting away from. The dog musher paused and nodded his head confidentially at Moosehide Mountain. Well, don't be a miser with what you know, Scott said sharply after waiting a suitable length of time. Spit it out. What is it? The dog musher indicated White Fang with a backward thrust of his thumb. Wolf or dog, it's all the same. He's been tamed already. No. I can tell you yes. And broke to harness. Look close there. Do you see them marks across the chest? You're right, Matt. He was a sled dog before Beauty Smith got hold of him. And there's not much reason against his being a sled dog again. What do you think? Scott queried eagerly. Then the hope died down as he added, shaking his head. We've had him 2 weeks now, and if he's anything, he's wilder than ever at the present moment. Give him a chance, Matt counselled. Turn him loose for a spell. The other looked at him incredulously. Yes, Matt went on. I know you've tried to, but you didn't take a club. You try it then. The dog musher secured a club and went over to the chained animal. White Fang watched the club after the manner of a caged lion watching the whip of its trainer. See him keep his eyes on that club, Matt said. That's a good sign. He's no fool. Don't tackle me so long as I got that club handy. He's not clean crazy, sure. As the man's hand approached his neck, White Fang bristled and snarled and crouched down. But while he eyed the approaching hand, he at the same time contrived to keep track of the club in the other hand, suspended threateningly above him. Matt unsnapped the chain from the collar and stepped back. White Fang could scarcely realise that he was free. Many months had gone by since he passed into the possession of Beauty Smith, and in all that period he had never known a moment of freedom, except at the times he had been loose to fight with other dogs. Immediately after such fights, he had always been imprisoned again. He didn't know what to make of it. Perhaps some new devilry of the gods was about to be perpetrated on him. He walked slowly and cautiously, prepared to be assailed at any moment. He did not know what to do. It was all so unprecedented. He took the precaution to sheer off from the two watching gods and walked carefully to the corner of the cabin. Nothing happened. He was plainly perplexed, and he came back again, pausing a dozen feet away and regarding the two men intently. Won't you run away? His new owner asked. Matt shrugged his shoulders. Got to take a gamble. Only way to find out is to find out. Poor devil, Scott murmured pityingly. What he needs is some show of human kindness, he added, turning and going into the cabin. He came out with a piece of meat, which he tossed to White Fang. He sprang away from it and from a distance studied it suspiciously. Hey you, Major, Matt shouted warningly, but too late. Major had made a spring for the meat. At the instant his jaws closed on it, White Fang struck him. He was overthrown. Matt rushed in, but quicker than he was, White Fang. Major staggered to his feet, with the blood spouting from his throat, red in the snow, in a widening path. It's too bad, but it served him right, Scott said hastily. But Matt's foot had already started on its way to kick White Fang. There was a leap, a flash of teeth, a sharp exclamation. White Fang, snarling fiercely, scrambled backwards for several yards, while Matt stooped and investigated his leg. You got me all right, he announced, pointing to the torn trousers and underclothes and the growing stain of red. I told you it was hopeless, Matt Scott said in a discouraged voice. I've thought about it on and off, while not wanting to think of it, but we've come to it now and it's the only thing to do. As he talked with reluctant movements, he drew his revolver, threw open the cylinder and assured himself of its contents. Look here, Mr. Scott, Matt objected. That dog's been through hell. You can't expect him to come out a white and shining angel. Give him time. Look at Major, the other rejoined. The dog musher surveyed the stricken dog. He had sunk down on the snow in the circle of his blood and was plainly in the last gasp. Served him right, you said so yourself, Mr. Scott. He tried to take White Fang's meat, and he's dead-o. That was to be expected. I wouldn't give 2 whoops in hell for a dog that wouldn't fight for his own meat. But look at yourself, Matt. It's all right about the dogs, but we must draw the line somewhere. Served me right, Matt argued stubbornly. What did I want to kick him for? You said yourself that he'd done right. Then I had no right to kick him. It would be a mercy to kill him, Scott insisted. He's untamable. Now look here, Mr. Scott, give the poor devil a fighting chance. He ain't had no chance yet. He's just gone through some hell. This is the first time he's been loose. Give him a fair chance, and if he don't deliver the goods, then I'll kill him myself. There. God knows I don't want to kill him or have him killed, Scott answered, putting away the revolver. We'll let him run loose and see what kindness can do for him, and here's a try at it. He walked over to White Fang and began talking to him gently and soothingly. Better have a club handy, Matt warned. Scott shook his head and went on trying to win White Fang's confidence. White Fang was suspicious. Something was impending. He had killed this god's dog, bitten his companion god, and what else was to be expected than some terrible punishment? But in the face of it, he was indomitable. He bristled and showed his teeth, his eyes vigilant, his whole body wary and prepared for anything. The god had no club, so he suffered him to approach quite near. The god's hand had come out and was descending upon his head. White Fang shrank together and grew tense as he crouched under it. Here was danger, some treachery or something. He knew the hands of the gods, their proved mastery, their cunning to hurt. Besides, there was his old antipathy to being touched. He snarled more menacingly, crouched still lower, and still the hand descended. He did not want to bite the hand, and he endured the peril of it until his instinct surged up in him, mastering him with his insatiable yearning for life. Weedon Scott had believed that he was quick enough to avoid any snap or slash, but he had yet to learn the remarkable quickness of White Fang, who struck with the certainty and swiftness of a coiled snake. Scott cried out sharply with surprise, catching his torn hand and holding it tightly in his other hand. Matt uttered a great oath and sprang to his side. White Fang crouched down and backed away, bristling, showing his fangs, his eyes malignant with menace. Now he could expect a beating as fearful as anything he had received from Beauty Smith. "Here, what are you doing?" Scott cried suddenly. Matt had dashed into the cabin and come out with a rifle. "Nothing," he said slowly with a careless calmness that was assumed. "Only going to keep that promise I made. I reckon it's up to me to kill him, as I said I'd do." "No, you don't." "Yes, I do. Watch me." As Matt had pleaded for White Fang when he had been bitten, it was now Weedon Scott's turn to plead. "You said to give him a chance. Well, give it to him. We've only just started and we can't quit at the beginning. It served me right this time, and look at him." White Fang, near the corner of the cabin and 40 feet away, was snarling with blood-curdling viciousness, not at Scott, but at the dog musher. "Well, I'll be everlastingly gosh-swoggled," was a dog musher's expression of astonishment. "Look at the intelligence of him," Scott went on hastily. "He knows the meaning of firearms as well as you do. He's got intelligence, and we've got to give that intelligence a chance. Put up the gun." "All right, I'm willing," Matt agreed, leaning the rifle against the woodpile. "But will you look at that?" he exclaimed the next moment. White Fang had quietened down and ceased snarling. "This is worth investigating. Watch." Matt reached for the rifle, and at the same moment White Fang snarled. He stepped away from the rifle, and White Fang's lifted lips descended, covering his teeth. "Now, just for fun." Matt took the rifle and began slowly to raise it to his shoulder. White Fang's snarling began with the movement and increased as the movement approached its combination. But the moment before the rifle came to a level on him, he leapt sideways behind the corner of the cabin. Matt stood staring along the sights at the empty space of snow which had been occupied by White Fang. The dog musher put the rifle down solemnly, then turned and looked at his employer. "I agree with you, Mr. Scott. That dog's too intelligent to kill."